a pleasure to open the Council's annual Frank and Cheri Hermance Atlas Award event. The Atlas Awards recognize individuals and institutions undertaking humanitarian service of one kind or another, who all exemplify the Council's original maxim: in a democracy, agreement is not essential, participation is. I want to begin this evening with a hearty thank you to all of the Council's corporate and individual supporters represented here this evening. Your support of our work and of this annual event in particular fuels all of our work with students and adults throughout our community. Tonight we recognize two individuals whose humanitarian service and particularly service to the Council's first principle, that democracy demands discourse, is truly unsurpassed. So we turn first to celebrate tonight our local honoree. And to make that presentation, please welcome up to the podium the chairman of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, Michael Farrell.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you, Craig. It's my true pleasure and honor as the Council's chairman to be able to present this evening the 2019 Atlas Award to our local honoree, Stanley Ginsburg. Stan is well known to everyone in this room, as is his beloved wife, Arlene, but it's my pleasant task to put on the record the depth of gratitude of everyone associated with the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia for the enormous support, both material and moral, which Stan has provided to our organization and to other related and worthy causes, including the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. Everything Stan has done in his philanthropic work has promoted education, inquiry, and all of the sorts of activities which support the fulfillment of the Council's credo that democracy demands discourse. Most particularly, Stan's challenge grant a number of years ago enabled the creation of the Council's Great Debate Series and has helped keep this organization and probably the entire city of Philadelphia at the center of the national marketplace of ideas about the greatest challenges of our times. Here's a few examples from our Stan and Arlene Ginsburg Great Debate stage. With events sometimes held at the august venue of Congress Hall, we've been able to hear John Bolton and Barney Frank debating America's national security policy. We've heard from Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer and a group of distinguished international lawyers discussing the increasingly vital relationship between domestic and international law. From leading constitutional scholars debating how the Supreme Court of the United States should properly interpret the Constitution, and of course from leading political strategists debating how President Trump defied the pundits and the polls to win the 2016 election. Stan was certainly an appropriate recipient of the Atlas Award for many years, but he and Arlene have been notably reticent to allow themselves to be recognized for their good works. I think it is only because they have come to agree with us that in recognizing them, we promote good works by others that has allowed us to be here in this setting tonight. So it is indeed my high honor now to name Stanley Ginsburg the local honoree of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia's 2019 Atlas Award. Stan, if you would please come forward to accept this small token of our appreciation.
they told me not to make a big speech, and so I cut it down to about a half an hour. Right, but Mike and Craig, thank you very much. I appreciate this honor. Arlene and I appreciate the honor that from World Affairs Council that you've extended to us. And we have followed this organization for many years, and it never stops growing and expanding due to the efforts of these leaders and the talented team that keeps them going. Keep going, guys. Right? You're doing a great job. Right. That's the end of my half-hour speech. Next victim.
I want to just add my own personal word of gratitude to Stan and Arlene, true friends of this organization and everything that the organization stands for in every possible sense of friendship. We love you guys. So, our next order of business is the presentation of this year's National Atlas Award to Jason Rezaian. I know that most, if not all of you, are familiar with Jason's horrifying but ultimately triumphant story. But we're going to set the table just a little bit by asking you to watch a short video presentation.
As print journalists, our job's difficult, but it's also kind of easy because there's so much to write about. When you walk down the street, you see a different side of things. People are proud, the culture is vibrant, people have a lot to say, but I love it. I love it, and I hate it, you know, but it's home.
What we know about Jason's arrest is that it was the evening of July 22nd. Some folks came to his house. He and his wife, Yeganeh, were arrested.
The Washington Post correspondent in Iran, Jason Rezaian, was arrested, pulled from his home, and placed in Iran's worst prison.
He's an Iranian citizen. Of course, he has U.S. nationality as well. We hope that he can provide satisfactory answers so that it can lead to his release.
About 6 weeks after Jason had been detained, his wife Yegi was released, and we began to think that things were moving in the right direction. We hoped that Jason would be next, and not long after that, got real signals that this was going to be tied up with the nuclear negotiations.
We all look forward to...
The nuclear negotiations were ongoing at the time, and it was our belief that Jason's detention had been sort of folded up into that, and that he was a chip that they were holding while they negotiated with the U.S. and other countries.
I'm not a Middle East expert. I'm certainly not an Iran expert. I can only say that I met two, from my heart, I met two wonderful people with very positive attitudes about Iran.
جیسون نه تنها پسر عزیز من هست ولی پسر ایرانم هست.
Jason has been imprisoned in Tehran for nothing more than writing about the hopes and the fears of the Iranian people.
We're learning this morning that Jason Rezaian has been convicted.
Rezaian's only contact with the outside world has been with his Iranian wife and his mother.
The back and forth went on for a long time. Ultimately, the Iranians relented.
Okay, this is how it's going to play out. Secretary Cheri, Javad Zarif, and Federica Mogherini of the EU are going to sign the nuclear deal. Immediately after that, Secretary Cheri is going to sign papers that will lift all the U.S. sanctions against Iran. At about the same time, a plane will take off from Tehran. It will have Jason Yegi. They will be among 5 American citizens who will be flown out.
A year and a half after he was first locked up, Jason Rezaian was finally reunited with his wife, mother, and brother. The Washington Post Tehran reporter also met his bosses from the newspaper and said, "I want people to know that physically I'm feeling good. I know people are eager to hear from me, but I want to process this for some time."
For much of the 18 months I was in prison, my Iranian interrogators told me that the Washington Post did not exist, that no one knew of my plight, and that the United States government would not lift a finger for my release. Today I'm here in this room with the very people who helped prove the Iranians wrong.
Jason Rezaian, whose new book, Prisoner, is a gripping account of the 544 days he spent in an Iranian prison.
I put up a Kickstarter project, the crowdfunding website, to raise funds to bring avocados to Iran. In the first night of interrogations, I was told that this was definitive proof that I was a spy. They didn't know what an avocado was, what this meant, what this was code for, but it was clearly something very nefarious.
How did you get through it?
Better to be as myself as possible. There's a possibility for me to use the platforms available to me to talk about issues relating Iran, and specifically foreign nationals being held there, because I know that story as well as anybody. But also about why it's important to protect press freedoms here at home and around the world.
How did you deal with the worst of this in terms of, were there times when you thought he was not going to come home?
Interestingly, one day I went to visit him, and I was crying, and I said, I think it was 7 months through his imprisonment, and I said, Jason, I can't do this. And he told me, as soon as we are released, we're going to go to America. I'm going to take you to America, and you're going to be an American, so there's no can't.
And lastly, I want to thank my family, my heroes, actually. My mom, Mary, my brother, Ali, and my wife, Yegi. You guys mean everything to me, and I'm just happy to be home with you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Along with several other people in the room here tonight, and a few others who weren't able to be with us, but who all, literally all, sent their best wishes. I had the great pleasure to meet Jason for the first time in April 2014, when he arrived in the lobby of the one-time pre-revolutionary Intercontinental Hotel in Tehran to brief and hold a discussion with members of one of our study tour groups. Jason spoke to our group with the immense nuance and insight that complicated matters of world affairs require but seldom receive in describing life in Iran and U.S.-Iranian relations. He also spoke with a simple and profoundly powerful decency about the relationship. He was candid, perhaps too much so, in talking about the high wire act that he had to walk as a journalist in Iran. Having, on the one hand, stories of his in the pages of the Washington Post, which painted an unflattering view of the Islamic Republic, what that might cause his minders to do to him. But ironically, I think at the time, we both thought the worst punishment might be that he'd be sent home. While on the other hand, the other part of the juggle, if he had stories that he would file that showed life in Iran to have a richness that was not completely summarized by a kind of cartoonish image of the place as a totalitarian and terroristic theocracy, that might not satisfy some folks back in Washington who had a preconceived notion of what Iranian reporting should be. Jason had taken an incredible, really brash leap as a young journalist a few years before I and my group had the opportunity to meet him, to go to Iran as a freelancer at a point in his career when peers were probably covering night court in Omaha and dreaming of someday having a foreign posting. But his work was so good that he landed the job as bureau chief for the Washington Post. He was newly married at that time of our first meeting and thinking out loud about future family plans and about returning home to the United States. And he loved the idea of sharing everything that he had learned and seen with larger audiences than our study group. So we set a date, October 2nd, 2014, when Jason would come and speak here at the podium of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Of course, When that date came, Jason had already long been a prisoner of the Iranian regime. On that date, some of you will remember, we held an event about Jason, since we couldn't have an event with him. So here we are, nearly 5 years later, and if there's ever a time to say better late than never, this is it. It is without question one of the great pleasures and honors of my tenure in this position to welcome to our podium the finest recipient possible for our 2019 National Atlas Award. Jason.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stan. Congratulations to you, Stan, for everything that you've done for this community. I haven't had the chance to get to know you yet, but I hope over dinner we'll have a chance to talk. It's a wonderful honor to get this recognition, but more than that, to see old friends. And the fact that some of you have come great distances to see me again is flattering, but also very humbling. And I truly appreciate that. Watching that video, some of it I actually hadn't seen before. I never watched that interview with Judy Woodruff on the PBS NewsHour. But when my wife talked about becoming an American, not an Americant, we always joked about that in the months after our release. And she just became an American last month. So, yeah. Which has been a big part of our kind of journey to recovery over the last couple of years. We've faced more obstacles than I care to talk about, but we've had tremendous support along the way. When I moved to Tehran 10 years ago to do this work, my goal was really to illuminate this place that, as Americans, we had decided we couldn't really know, that we couldn't really understand. So far away, so different, many would say evil. But I didn't buy it. And the reason I kind of bristled against that characterization of Iran was the fact that I grew up in a family that was predominantly Iranian. My dad had moved from Iran to the United States in the late 1950s to go to college. And my mom was from Wheaton, Illinois, which is about the most evangelical community in the country, I think it's fair to say, one of them. They met in San Francisco, where they were both studying, and that was a place that was about as ideologically far away from the two places that they had come from as was imaginable. So for me and my big brother, we grew up in this household that was very American, but at the same time very Iranian. And I felt, as I grew into adulthood and knew that I wanted to be a journalist, that I would have insight into that country that was maybe a little different than the average reporter. And so I took that leap of faith. I want to have a conversation with you all tonight and save time for as many questions as you have, but I want to tell a quick story. The hostage crisis, which many of you will remember, was sort of a defining moment for my family. At that time, my dad had lived in the United States for 20 years. He'd been a U.S. citizen for almost 10. He was a Persian rug merchant, had a business just north of San Francisco in Marin County, which those of you who know it to be one of the more liberal and progressive parts of the country. In the month leading up to the hostage crisis, in October of 1979, my dad did $400,000 in sales in Persian rugs. I remember that number because he talked about it all the time. In the 6 months following the taking of the embassy and the 52 American hostages,
he didn't do a single dollar in business for 6 months. It tore our lives apart. And for him, it was a very rude awakening. He had lived his entire adult life in this country, had put all his eggs in the American basket, and felt deeply betrayed. But people came to his support. Some didn't. Some folks abandoned him. But he always, when people would ask him where he was from, because even though he spoke perfect English, he spoke it with a very thick accent that lasted his entire life, he would say that I'm Iranian by birth and I'm American by choice, and I'm proud of both. And so I tried to take that with me into my work as a journalist covering that country for many years. As the hostage crisis progressed, his business continued to falter, and then ultimately, on the day that the hostage was released, which was Ronald Reagan's inauguration, it was a great day for all Americans, but specifically for Americans of Iranian background, because it was a relief that they had been waiting for a long time, and they would hope that the pressures that they'd faced from other Americans would recede. So like many businesses, I don't know if y'all were familiar with this, but at the time, lots of businesses gave gifts to the hostages. So the Tourism Board of Hawaii invited all of them and their families on an all-expense-paid trip to Hawaii. Nebraska sent steaks. Major League Baseball gave each of the hostages a golden ticket for life. They could go to any regular season baseball game at any stadium in the major leagues with one guest for the rest of their lives. And I've met hostages who are still using it 40 years later. And my dad made a very public gesture and offered a Persian rug to each one of those hostages. Of the 52, 44 took him up on it. I still have many of the thank you letters that they sent. And actually, recently I visited the home of one of those former hostages who lives in Northern Virginia. And as we were walking around the house, he pointed to that rug and flipped over the corner of it, and there was the Rezaian Persian rug label on the back. I'm telling you all of this because this is a part of American history that we've heard from one side for a very long time. And I hoped in going to Iran that I'd be able to tell the story of Iranians more completely, with more color and more nuance. And if I've been able to do that, I'm very proud of that. And I just, again, want to thank you all for being here tonight, for recognizing me in this way, and for bringing me to Philadelphia, which is one of my favorite cities. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we turn to politics and policy, let's continue, if you'll indulge us, a little bit in the personal vein. You've endured unendurable things, and you're out speaking and writing about events that are in a lot of ways unspeakable. So how are you, physically, emotionally, and in terms of the project that you've discussed of turning your ordeal into something positive for freedom of the press?
Physically, I'm doing pretty well. I think in the first months after my release, there were a lot of issues, mineral and vitamin deficiencies that need to be addressed. I didn't have adequate health care that entire time. I slept on a concrete floor for the first 6 months, so my back still kind of hurts. But nothing really permanent that I can complain about. On a psychological level, the effects of that sort of experience are
permanent. And you have to come at some point to acceptance of that, and that took quite a while for me to do. I spent 49 days in solitary confinement. My wife spent 72 days, her entire imprisonment in solitary confinement. And so 4 years later, we still have lingering fears and paranoia in a lot of different situations. The entire 544 days I spent in rooms that were artificially lit 24 hours a day. So I still have a lot of sensitivity to light, to sound. I don't do well in public places when there are people behind me. All of these things that I've spoken to prisoners of war and other veterans about, they're the telltale signs of PTSD. But for me, the thing that has been the most, I think the strongest indicator is recognizing the voice in my own head as me. And it's taken a long time, but I feel like I'm almost myself again. And like I said, you have to give yourself permission to be wounded and a little different than you were before. Otherwise, it's a recipe for disappointment.
Thank you. So when you look back now, do you feel there's anything you could have done differently that would have avoided this, or was it sort of inevitable at that moment that you were going to be a bargaining chip in international negotiations?
I don't think that it was inevitable, and I don't think it was necessary. The people who took me were, we talk about Iranians, people in the Iranian regime as hardliners and moderates. I don't like those terms. I think of it as the people who want to engage with the rest of the world and those who want to take a more insular approach. Because we're not talking about people who are in line with us and our ideals in any way, right? These are not progressive thinking people. So I was taken at the height of the negotiations by the group that was most in favor of not having engagement with the rest of the world. But I think by the time I was taken, the writing was on the wall that this deal between Iran and the rest of the world was going to happen. The train had left the building already. It was a foregone conclusion that there would be a deal between world powers and Iran in the coming months. So I don't think it was really serving the purpose that they had hoped. Maybe if they had done it 6 months earlier, it would have made more sense. But their goal in doing this was to really scuttle the deal before it was even signed, and obviously that didn't happen. So I think as you and others who visited Iran during that time, and some of you since, could see, I think, the way that society works, the people are much more open than you would imagine, and their ability to express themselves within an authoritarian society is actually probably more than you would expect. So I saw that trend going in that direction of opening for many years. And I was as surprised as anybody when I was taken, and I'm still kind of scratching my head thinking, what did they expect was going to happen? I think it was a miscalculation.
So in your view then, essentially they failed, right? The people who decided to take you failed to achieve the objective of scuttling the deal. But within the American political context, there are folks who look at the deal and say that Iran defined, in the aggregate,
right,
sort of got something more than they would have, got concessions from the United States in order to obtain your release and the release of other Americans. Do you think that's true?
Look, there were lots of concessions going back and forth. And, the one that
people have been laser focused on was the transfer of funds from the U.S. to Iran on the day of my release. The backstory on that is that during the final months of the Shah's reign, before the revolution in Iran and before the Islamic Republic was founded, the Shah of Iran had signed an arms deal with the U.S. and made a down payment of $400 million. That money, along with other Iranian assets, were seized and held in the United States frozen during all that time. A tribunal was set up in 1982 in The Hague to, what's the term I'm looking for? To resolve the disputes, to mediate, right? To mediate claims back and forth between Iran and the U.S. And in the past 38 years, billions of dollars have been paid out in both directions. This particular case around the frozen $400 million was about to come up for a decision. And it was clear that the U.S. was going to lose, and we were going to lose with heavy fines and a lot of interest to the tune of between $4 and $6 billion. At the same time, the Iranians wanted some sort of cash acknowledgement of this deal because they realized late in the game that the sanctions that were to be lifted would not result in any kind of windfall in the short term. So U.S. negotiators decided to offer a partial payment of that money at a much reduced rate compared to what they expected to have to pay based on that judgment, and that's what they did. I think if you read the timeline, and I go into great detail towards the end of the book about this, it was not a ransom. It was a separate component of the deal, and one that was negotiated separately but became leverage in the final hours. I'll leave it at that because I think it's the best part of the book.
Got to read the book. You've said, we saw on the clip, that your jailers told you nobody cared about you, nobody was going to try to get you out. Why do you think they wanted you to believe that? What was the purpose of that? And did there ever come a moment when you started to believe it?
Early on, I wasn't sure what to believe. They had told me that it had been reported that my wife and I died in a car accident. And Iran has a pretty horrific traffic death situation, so that seemed pretty plausible. And when you're in solitary confinement, the entire goal is to break you down mentally, to make you malleable. And they were trying to get me to go to court and confess to spying for the United States. And I'll tell you, when you go through a period of prolonged solitary confinement, at a certain point, you will start to do things to get out of that. So I think their goal was more than anything to break me down, to get me to publicly confess to things that I didn't do, so that they could use that as propaganda in their efforts to break apart the negotiations. But they weren't successful in doing that. I was forced to do kind of taped confessions, and I zigged when they zagged, and changed the story and said things that didn't go according to their script. And so they threw the towel in on that. And later, when I talked to U.S. officials about that, I talked to John Cheri actually specifically about it. And he said, we assumed that they would have done that to you and that they would have those sorts of tapes and they might make them public, but it wouldn't have had any impact on how we dealt with the situation because we knew that you didn't work for them. And it was such a public outcry for your release that we had to figure it out.
Do you think that this faction, if you will, believed you were a spy, or that was just that was the story they wanted to tell the world?
It's a tough question to answer in a very direct way. There were definitely people that I dealt with
who thought that I was guilty because their bosses said I was guilty. And these are not people that believe in any kind of rule of law. Their goal is to perpetuate and keep the Islamic Republic political order propped up, and they're going to do whatever it takes to do that. They're sycophants. And I would say that they believed that I was guilty of something. If they could explain it or not is another question. But the people that took me hostage, who were the architects of the plan, they knew I was a journalist for the Washington Post, and that would have public appeal. You know, it would garner the kind of attention that they wanted. They were trying to do something audacious, and that's what it was.
So I want to turn to current U.S.-Iran relations and your views. So let me kind of lay out an argument that's being advanced in some political quarters at the moment and get your reaction to it. So there is an argument that says that right now we're seeing the Iranians take a series of kind of aggressive steps in the Gulf and elsewhere because, this argument goes, the Trump policy of maximum pressure, ratcheting up the sanctions, is working. It's squeezing the hardliners or the more insular folks, as you say. And again, this argument goes, these folks watched the United States do this to the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. They watched that regime go from being very formidable militarily to the point where it was able to threaten the Islamic Republic itself. And then by the time of the US invasion in 2003, it was a 3-week cakewalk because there was no capacity left. So the argument is they see the sanctions as something that, if they stick for a long time, are going to essentially kill the power of that regime, and therefore use it while you have it, which is now, and strike out and try to force President Trump to choose between concession versus all-out war, on the assumption that he does not want all-out war.
I think that there's some logic to that argument when you look at the situation as it is right now. Remember that the Trump administration and all of the foreign policy, national security apparatus is saying, we're not trying to change the regime. We are trying to compel them into a negotiation to redo this deal. From the Iranian point of view, we did a deal. It was an international, legally binding document, and now America, took the ball and ran away. So I think that their striking out right now is more about heightened U.S. presence in the region, threats from the U.S. I think it's pretty logical what they're doing in response. I would say that the maximum pressure campaign in terms of sanctions is working to weaken the economy and sow discord within the Iranian populace. At the same time, the military might of the regime is pretty well intact. And when I say might, we got to remember this is a military that's smaller than the Dutch military. We've turned these guys into a much bigger problem than they actually are. They would not stand a chance in any kind of conventional fight, but they have other tools, economic and cultural tools in that region that go back many centuries, relationships with every one of their neighbors that we can't begin to understand. So I think that their attitude is, we've seen many American administrations come and go in the last 40 years. In the last 2,500 years, we've seen many other major powers come and go. And we're still going to be Iran tomorrow, whether or not the United States attacks us.
So in the brief time that I've spent in Iran, I came away with the view that Persian nationalism is a much stronger power, if you will, among the Iranian people than an identification with the regime or the Khomeini canon of ideology. The flip side of that is the idea that if there ever was a war, that what the United States would be fighting would be Persian nationalism, and that would be formidable, whereas support of the regime may be weak. Do you think that's right?
I think that is yes and no. I mean, I think that there are a lot of people that, and probably the vast majority of people, that want to see an end to the Islamic Republic as an entity. At the same time, it's not a at all costs proposition for them. And the way that most Iranians that I've dealt with in my many years of living there and in the years since envision it is these guys are going to die. You know, the idea of an Islamic theocracy, a modern Islamic theocracy, was born in Iran, and it's probably going to reach its demise first in Iran compared to other countries in the region. My attitude has always been, let Iranians figure it out. They're educated, intelligent people with a lot of know-how in terms of business and science, and ultimately that's going to trump any kind of Islamic ideology, which I think is destined to fail. On the question of Iranian nationalism, the regime is starting to take advantage of that. The messaging has gone very far away from, you know, the messaging that they were putting out during the 8-year war with Iraq, that this is a holy war and we're Shias fighting against Sunni invaders, and you know it fits in with their worldview. Now I think the authorities in the Islamic Republic are starting to realize, no, we have to play on those nationalist sentiments or we're going to lose these people entirely. And I don't think that right now the policies coming from Washington directed at Iran are not taking into account that nationalist trait. Everything that we are doing right now that is intended to be directed at the Iranian regime actually ends up affecting the Iranian people. We have this travel ban that I'm sure you all have heard about that essentially blocks Iranians from coming to this country. Sanctions that we are placing on that country right now have made it impossible for Iran to import all sorts of life-saving drugs that they can't produce themselves. So you've got, you know, pediatric cancer patients dying because they're not getting drugs that would be readily available in any other society in the world. This is not a good look for us. And it's not how we should be promoting democracy in that part of the world. We've tried this before, and the results in Iraq have been a real mixed bag. And I think we should be learning more from that history than we are.
What do you think the purpose is of Iran in the region, right? The efforts in Yemen, the efforts in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. Are they trying to be a regional hegemon, trying to really contain the Saudis? Is that a kind of, in your view, a kind of a blood feud that could erupt into actual war?
I think it certainly could. And I think if it comes to military might, Iran is obviously outmatched. You know, the Saudis and their allies have a lot more firepower available to them, and they also have the backing of the United States. But I think if you go back and if you really probe the people that brought the nuclear deal to fruition from the American and the European side, a lot of that was about checking Saudi power. We don't talk about that, but Saudi Arabia has not been a good neighbor, and they haven't been a good friend to us. And I think that there's a lot of people in Washington, in Brussels, in London, in Berlin, trying to figure out how do we dial down the stranglehold that they have on our policy in that part of the world. And I think Iran is incredibly opportunistic about that and realizes that if we kind of comport ourselves in a way that we can prove ourselves to be reliable partners, if not allies, strategic partners, then the tides will turn. I just don't think that they're turning fast enough for the average Iranian
And I think that ultimately we are on the verge of a big conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And actually, we're already in the middle of a conflict. It's just not direct.
So, your description of the Iranian people tonight and in your body of work, right? You don't depict them as being Jeffersonian Democrats, walking around in favor of a revolution.
Right.
But you clearly seem to believe that they want more freedom of conduct in their personal lives and their economic lives, and that they want to live in, quote unquote, a normal country, right, as opposed to a revolutionary country that's a pariah in the world. If you were making U.S. policy toward Iran, how would you encourage those sentiments among the people to be successful in the context of this authoritarian regime?
So, I mean, I think if you give every human being their druthers and, give them the option, just about everybody's going to choose secular democracy where you get to decide how you want to live your life. They might not decide on day one that they want that, but, over time, it's something that I think most people desire. So, my prescription, I think it's pretty easy, would be to embrace the Iranians. And I think we do that rhetorically sometimes in our messaging, our public messaging to them. But let them come here. Let them do business here. I was in communication often, still am, with people at the State Department who work on public diplomacy programs, leading not the sorts of trips that World Affairs Councils do, but more deliberate programs, long-term business opportunities, training people in different industries, give them access to everything that makes America a wonderful and free society. Let them see it, let them feel it, let them experience it, and let them go home and tell people about it. I just watched an incredible interview. I guess it was NBC. Lester Holt is in Tehran this week. He actually interviewed a Revolutionary Guard commander. These guys are starting to understand how they need to message to us. We shouldn't be giving the podiums to their foreign minister or their president or their revolutionary commanders. We should be giving opportunities to normal people rather than blocking them from coming here. I was at Stanford a few months ago giving a talk, and I was told that this year not a single Iranian was given a visa to come and study at Stanford. We're talking about a university that generally hosts about 200 new Iranians every year. Iran in the 1970s, from the mid-60s actually up until the day of the revolution in 1979, sent more students to American universities than any other country in the world. And that continued up until the last few years. Now we're telling them they can't come. What sort of message? How do we think that we're going to cultivate democratic sentiment in the society that we are not allowing anyone from that society to even commingle with democracy? So I think open it up and open up trade. Iran, as you've seen, is a country of many businesses. I imagine somebody in the room has been to North Korea. Anybody? Neither have I. But North Korea, as I understand it, is not a place where the free market reigns. Cuba, some people have been to Cuba, right? Yeah. Cuba is a place where there is a lot of tiny business, right? But Iran is a country that runs on small businesses, and we are cutting those people out cutting their legs out from under them. Let them do business with people. Regulate it. Interrogate it. Figure out who they're working with inside of the country, but don't block them entirely from the rest of the world. If you want to integrate a country into the community of responsible nations, you've got to let the people of that nation communicate and be a part of the world.
And maybe even have avocados.
They have to have avocados, yeah. It's another great part of the book. I hope you get to it.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Staff has microphones, so if you raise your hand, we will come around and get those questions. Who wants to go first?
Jason, it seems like one of the purposes behind the Iran nuclear deal was to reinforce moderates in Iran, hoping that this would open them up to Western values with additional business opportunities and diplomacy. And of course, that hasn't happened because of the reversal of the deal. And it seems to me that the reversal of the deal was trying to either get Iran to capitulate so that we get a better deal, or create a revolution in the society that would be prompted by the terrible economy that the sanctions would produce. My question to you is, was it ever a realistic idea to assume that this deal would have produced elements of pressure to produce greater democratization and freedom in Iran and moderating Iran's policy? And on the other hand, what do you see the consequences of Trump's breaking of this deal to be?
So I think that I don't think the deal was going to lead to democratization in and of itself, but it was going to lead to more interaction. And the conventional wisdom among the people who worked on the deal on the American and on the European side was, here's the biggest ticket item that we have, the biggest problem that we have with Iran. If we can solve this one, we're going to be able to find ways to solve other ones, whether it's Syria, Yemen, Iran's attitude towards Israel. All of these things are things we can work out once we figure this biggest problem first. I think what wasn't taken into account was the lingering lack of trust on both sides. And the problem from the Iranian side was the opportunities, the business opportunities didn't come quickly enough. And I would say that that's just as much Iran's fault as it is American sanctions' fault. For example, I spoke to executives at some major American corporations who were looking to do business in Iran, but when they would send their engineers to work on parts that were purchased, whether it was Boeing or car companies that wanted to do business with Iran, they would send engineers from Pakistan and Bangladesh, and the Iranians would say, why aren't you sending any American engineers? And the response from Boeing is, well, you're putting Americans in prison. Why are we going to send our engineers over there, right? And so that's something that the Iranians did not account for. And I know in the waning months of the Obama administration, they were very upset that American businesses weren't rushing to Iran. And the administration's attitude was, we can't force people to come. So I think it was something that was maybe oversold in their own minds about what was possible. In terms of the fallout from coming out of the deal, the economic situation is horrible right now. I am not a believer that strangling a society economically is the best way to get them to seek democracy. I've experienced it on the ground in Iran in 2011, 2012, when people's wallets are lighter and the noose is being tightened around their neck. The last thing they're thinking about is going out and trying to have more social freedoms. They're thinking about, how do I put food on the table? How do I care for my sick loved ones? How do I survive today? So we're not really doing anything right now other than making their lives more miserable. And I just don't see that coming to the conclusion that we're looking for anytime soon. And one other thing I would say is, when you're trying to cultivate civil society and really build up civil society in a country, these sorts of measures really destroy all of those opportunities. And at the same time, the Iranian regime, when it faces pressure from the outside, clamps down even further on people within its own borders. So, I think As usual, the people of Iran are friendless. They have no friend in the government that rules over them, and they don't have one here.
This was very, very interesting. We followed it, and we've watched, at least I watched the CBS Sunday News, and Prisoner was on my list, so I'm very happy.
Thank you.
To get it.
Appreciate it.
There's a British citizen, woman, that's also incarcerated in Iran. When Boris Johnson was foreign minister, he went over ostensibly to get her released, but misspoke. And the Iranians interpret what he said was, in fact, she was a spy. He's now prime minister. And besides Brexit, this is pretty much the top 4 or 5 issues on the prime minister's agenda. Do you have any insight on the update of her case at all?
So, yeah, I've been following that case very closely since the day that she was arrested, which is about 3 months after I was released. The backstory on that is a woman named Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe. She's Iranian by birth, moved to the UK, married a man named Richard. They have a little girl named Gabriella. Nazanin and Gabriella returned to Iran for holidays to visit her parents in early 2016, and when they went to the airport, she was taken into custody, separated from her daughter. It's now 3.5 years that she's been in prison. Her daughter is still in Iran with her grandparents, and Richard is in London. He hasn't seen his wife and daughter in all this time. He's been an incredible advocate for her, similar to my brother. The difference being that at that time, the Obama administration was involved in direct negotiations with Iran that made it possible to negotiate my release. And as you alluded to, Boris Johnson's mishandling of that situation was probably the biggest blemish on his record as foreign secretary. The first piece that I wrote the day that he was elected prime minister was, you got to fix this problem. You know, you made this problem. She was already. It wasn't his fault that she was arrested, but he went to Tehran, as you said, to get her out. He had misspoken about what she was doing. She's an aid worker for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is separate from the news organization, and has been held as a spy ever since. And they've made it pretty clear that they want money in exchange for her release. Now, you know, I don't know how the British government deals with those situations, but so far they haven't dealt with it very well. And I think it's shocking to me that this could go on as long as it has. And you know, every time I'm asked to comment about it or end up writing a piece about it, it breaks my heart that this little girl, who's now 5 years old, has no memory of her father. Father is back in London. He's an accountant. He's trying to figure out how to bring his family back together. This poor young woman who's now spent the last 3 years in prison. The latest news I read was just yesterday, actually, that the prison has changed the rules for visitations, so her daughter is only allowed to come visit her once a month rather than twice a week, and she's no longer allowed to call Richard in England. So, you know, this is all designed to make her suffer, and you know, the world recognizing this suffering is supposed to spring into action. And I always tell people when we talk about these cases of foreign nationals being held by Iran or other countries, it's different when you're talking about ISIS or Boko Haram. I mean, they have very different goals. But the vast majority of times that a state takes a person hostage, they're doing it to get in some kind of concession from that other state who the hostage has nationality with. And I just don't see that the British government is living up to that. You know, my attitude has always been, shine as much of a light on this as possible. Don't shut up about it. Keep her name in the news. But the Brits aren't playing ball.
Hi. I have two questions related, I think, about the Iranian people. The first part would be, I think this administration and prior administrations have gone out of their way to draw distinction between their issues with the regime versus their concern for the Iranian people. So first question is, does that filter through to the Iranian people? Is there any sort of recognition of that? And then the second piece is, I'm sure everybody's seen these videos of large group of Iranians gathering, chanting "Death to America, death to Israel." How reflective is that attitude of the common, everyday Iranian?
I'll take the second part first. It's not reflective of the average person. And actually, those are staged events that happen on a weekly basis. My dad told me a funny story one time after he went to, he returned to Iran to visit for the first time after being away for about 25 years. And he saw a friend of his from high school. And the guy had a pager, right? A beeper. And my dad sort of was making fun of him, as the kind of guy he was. And he said, well, you know, what's that for? What do you need the beeper for? And the guy said, well, it's for my work. He said, what are you, a doctor? You know? And he said, no, I work for the regime. I've got 8 kids. When they need to fill a crowd, they text me, they beat me an address, and I show up, right? They feed us, they pay me a monthly salary, and that's what we do, right? If you get 100,000 people saying one thing, like "Death to America," even if you're saying it at a very low level, 100,000 people is going to make a loud noise. And when you pan into those crowds of people, and I've been among them, there's not a lot of fervor. It's not the same as it was in 1979 or 1980 when this was first happening. I think the further you get away from that revolutionary moment of 40 years ago, and this is the same in any revolutionary society, the weaker that feeling becomes. I will say, in terms of Israel, I think there's more and more discussion in the public in Iran. Why are we supporting the Palestinians financially? Why are we sending money to Hezbollah and PLO and the Syrians? We have our own problems here. Think about us, work for us. And I think that there's really no issue with the Iranian people and the people of Israel. On your first question, tell me what it was again?
The distinction that...
Okay. Yeah. And the people, yeah. So I think that there was a moment during the Obama administration when Obama was messaging a lot directly to the Iranian people. He did a lot of interviews on Farsi television, both on the VOA and the BBC Farsi services, trying to explain U.S. Policy, and people were very receptive to that. But if you go back over the years, they haven't been so convinced that the U.S. has their best interests at heart. And for some of those same reasons that I explained about, travel ban and crushing sanctions, people feel like, okay, well, great, you consider us differently than the regime, but you're putting your heel on our necks, not on theirs. And I think we haven't done a good job here of proving to them that we can draw that distinction in a practical way.
First of all, thank you for sharing what you have. It's very moving.
A pleasure.
Following up a little bit to that last question, and this deals more with Iran and its support of Hezbollah and some of the other groups, and relating that apparently there are people in Iran who are not very happy about how money's maybe being spent.
The majority of people.
The majority.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? If we were like policymakers in the U.S. or different people in Europe or different people trying to think of a solution to move forward, besides just the nuclear weapon issue, but where do we go forward to try to change that with Iran and try to work out a deal with Iran to stop that?
I think the first thing we have to do, from my point of view, is bring the tension level down, right? Every move that we've made in the last 16 months since we pulled out of the nuclear deal has been designed to ratchet up tension, right? We're sending warships to the Gulf. We've got drones that are routinely flying into Iranian territory. Of course they're going to shoot them down, right? I mean, that's pretty logical. So I think we have to lower the level of tension and open up a channel of some kind of communication. But we've cut off every channel of talking that we have with that regime. And I just don't see why. I mean, we're the most powerful country in the history of the world. We have every tool available to us. Why are we afraid of having conversations that, in theory, if we're talking about values and ideals, we know we're going to win? Why wouldn't we have those conversations? So I think it's a matter of, and again, to go back to kind of Obama-era outreach, I've talked to a lot of Cubans who talk about Obama's visit to Havana and how weak that made Castro and the 60-year Castro reign feel to the Cuban people. Here was this guy that came from America, was willing to answer journalist questions, every question, nothing had to be filtered. He only required that his counterparts did the same. Went to a baseball game and enjoyed himself, and people went away thinking, wow, America really is the land of the free, right? And I think that we're going to win a rhetorical argument every time with Iran as long as we're honest about it. And I just don't think we have been. Yeah.
You mentioned that your dad felt betrayed in your remarks earlier. Did you feel betrayed, or do you feel betrayed?
That's the second time I've been asked that question in recent days, and I hadn't been asked that before. I didn't feel betrayed because I understood the makeup of how that society works. I understood the rules of engagement, and the world that I was living in came with inherent risks. But I believe that because I did my job to the letter of the law and was very transparent about it, and was working for the paper of record of the American Capitol, that this wasn't something that I had to worry about at that time. Craig alluded to the fact that I had taken this risk and gone to Iran. In those early years, I worried about what happened, what eventually happened to me all the time. But I wasn't worried about it at that time, that it did happen. If anything, no. I mean, I think thrust into that situation, and I remember very specifically my wife, very upset. We had the clip of Iran's foreign minister saying, Jason will go to court, he's an Iranian citizen, and hopefully has the opportunity to clear his name. She was so angry that this guy was going out and basically sullying my name in public and sowing doubt about me. And I said, hey, he is the representative, the international face of this regime. What do you expect? This is the way that it is. People ask me all the time if I'm disappointed with how the Obama administration handled my release. And I'm going to have to quote my lawyer and my boss, the publisher of the Washington Post, Fred Ryan. I asked them both, what grade do you give the Obama administration in how they handled this? Because these guys were on the front lines of it. And both of them, separately and almost verbatim said, well, you're here now, so we have to give them a passing grade. And, we can laugh about that and take it lightly, but the reality is that the vast majority of Americans who are held hostage abroad don't come home alive. It's because, in large part, we have what we call a no concessions policy when it comes to hostage taking. Ultimately, though, that 25% or so who do come home because there was a concession. So, this is one of these things where I'm a test case in a problem that, unfortunately, is not going away and is only getting bigger. Iran started this modern trend of government hostage taking, but other people have caught on as well. And I don't think it's going to stop with me or with Nazanin, the British woman, or any of the others who are being held in Iran or Venezuela or North Korea or Turkey, Egypt, many other countries.
We have time for just one more. I see a hand over here.
Jason, one question. Did you know when your wife was released, like immediately?
It was about, I want to say it was about 5 days, maybe a week after she was released. In the last several weeks that she was being held, we were allowed to see each other several times for very brief moments.
Okay.
And I had no news from her. I wasn't allowed to see her for several days. And then they took me into a room, and this would be the room that I would end up having my visits with my mother and my wife whenever they would happen. And my wife came in wearing her own clothes. And it was a huge relief, but it was also heartbreaking because I was still there. And but the sort of feeling of responsibility for my wife and this plight, because she would never have been arrested if she wasn't married to me. It was a real release. It made it so that I could, focus more directly on my own situation and not have my mind wandering to what might be being done to her.
Did it give you that little bit of hope that
I always
continue
maintained,
on?
I always looked for things that would give me a shot of hope,
Yeah.
and that was one of those things that made me think, okay, if she's out, I will get out at some point. I just didn't think it would take another 500 days.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jason, I want to thank you once again for being with us. I want to thank all of you, and we are adjourned to dinner. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you all.